I wanted to go over with you prior to Ken's presentation the affirmations of humanistic Jews. They include human beings possess the power and responsibility to shape their own lives independent of supernatural authority. A Jew is a person who identifies with the history, culture, and future of the Jewish people. Judaism is the historic culture of the Jewish people. Jewish history is a human saga, a testament to the significance of human power and human responsibility. Ethics and morality should serve human needs. The freedom and dignity of the Jewish people must go hand in hand with the freedom and dignity of every human being. And finally, the one that I wanted to focus particularly on today was Jewish identity is best preserved in a free, pluralistic environment. So, in many of the events that humanistic Judaism communities have, we don't talk about what is special about America. And that's why I invited Professor Ken Wald to talk with us today. Based on a lot of his writings, but particularly his most recent book called The Foundations of Jewish Liberalism, which I recently read and thought was just fantastic. So, an introduction. Kenneth D. Wald is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Political Science and the Samuel R. Shorstein Professor Emeritus of American Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Florida. His books include Religion and Politics in the United States and Foundations of American Jewish Liberalism, winner of the 2020 National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. He has held visiting appointments at Harvard University, the University of Michigan, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Haifa University, the University of Toronto, and Linnaeus University. In 2018, Professor Wald was the Halsworth Visiting Professor at the University of Manchester in England. In 2011, he was named Teacher Scholar of the Year, the highest faculty award given by the University of Florida. The son of Holocaust survivors and grandson of Holocaust victims, he's currently working on a family memoir about the Holocaust. So Ken, would you like to share some of your thoughts with us? And I have a PowerPoint that you've given me, and tell me when you'd like me to share it.
Okay, well, let me just say a few words at first. Are you going to enlarge the screen, or how are you doing that?
What I'm going to do is to spotlight your video so it takes up the screen for people.
Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon. I want to apologize for the zombie-like appearance of the death rays coming out of my glasses. I've just got a new computer and the camera is exceptionally good, and nothing I've been able to do has gotten rid of it. So while I'm on screen, I'm going to take these off. So it scared me when I first saw it, and I don't want it to do the same to you. Having been born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska, what we proudly called the Nebraska diaspora, I don't win very many games of Jewish geography. So I'm pleased that the audience today includes a number of my friends from Gainesville and also people from states where I've been a visiting professor. I spent a semester in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan in their Center for Jewish Studies, and another semester at the University of Toronto's Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. So it's nice to see, know that I'm speaking to people from certain places. And I noticed somebody from Arizona. My oldest daughter did a 2-year postdoc at Arizona State a few years ago, so there's even a brief connection there. So I want to talk about the book that I published last year, which it seems to me is highly relevant to the themes that you're exploring. And I think this would be a good time to put up the PowerPoint, so you have to see less of me and more of the argument. When Rick does get it up, I'll occasionally just ask him to click, so I don't have to worry about controlling it. And I thought click Rick is sort of a nice way to say it, so you'll know what's involved. Okay, let me first of all thank the humanistic Judaism community for the invitation, and also to thank Paul from Jews for a Secular Democracy, who I met in Gainesville when Rick brought him in to speak to you. I'm pleased to speak to both of the organizations. And if we can click to the next screen. I want to start with something that happened more than a century and a half ago at Congregation B'nai Israel, as it was spelled, in Cincinnati. This was, I believe, the first synagogue established west of the Mississippi River. And on June 5th of 1868, they had a celebration because they had just lowered the cornerstone of their new synagogue, which is pictured in the lower left or on the left side. And as is customary, as was the custom of the day, they created a time capsule, which they put in the foundation stone. And this was a metal box that had a number of documents and objects that presumably a century from that date would be unveiled, and people could see the history of the town and the congregation. Can we have a click, please? Most of these items are not surprising for a synagogue to consider critical or important documents. So there was a copy of the first Jewish sermon preached in Cincinnati. Click. There was a history of the congregation. And there was, thirdly, this being a Jewish organization, click please, a list of the contributors who had made the new building possible. No Jewish event is usually adequate without a list of contributors. And there was also a list of the other Jewish institutions in Cincinnati. Now, there's nothing about any of these things that would be surprising. We'd kind of expect stuff like this when a congregation created a time capsule in the mid-19th century. But there was another thing put in that time capsule that kind of threw me. And if you could click on this, Rick. They put in a copy of the United States Constitution. And I really kind of found this strange because the Constitution, as it was adopted in 1780 or written in 1789, said almost nothing about religion. In fact, the only thing it said was there shall be no religious tests for holding public office. And then 4 years later, when the Bill of Rights was added, there were other prohibitions saying what the state couldn't do. So I found it odd the Constitution would have been treated as something that belonged in a time capsule of a synagogue at that time. If we can go to the next slide, please. I spent a lot of time wondering why would this congregation put the Constitution among the items that it venerated. And it occurred to me that by this time in American history, after doing a lot of reading and a lot of consulting, that members of the American Jewish community really thought that their success in the United States was built on constitutional foundations. Again, we can have a click here. In a sense, by putting the Constitution in the foundation stone, they were recognizing the foundational role of that document and the political system that it created from its contribution to the success of American Jews. Next click, please. The Constitution, the political system that it created, was a classic liberal regime. That is to say, it was built on the principles of liberalism as that doctrine existed in the late or in the 18th century. This kind of liberalism was distinctive from the kind of liberalism we have today, which tends to emphasize economic equality. At this time, the classic liberalism focused much more on individual rights having to do with the civil sphere. We have a click here. The Constitution, in its creation of this regime, provided its citizens with both civil and religious rights. For example, in Article 4, it was interpreted to indicate that residents of the United States who were capable of participating in governance were to enjoy equal citizenship. That citizenship was not to be based on blood and soil, the criteria that are beloved today by nationalists, ultra-nationalists, but rather simply was based on being in the country and acceding or agreeing to the American system of government. Article 6 of the Constitution, as I mentioned, prohibited any religious tests for holding public office. Such tests were very common in the colonies that became the states. And when the First Amendment was added, it said the state could not provide any legal recognition or privileges to any religion, nor could it inhibit any individual's free exercise of religion, provided it comported with the law. Let's have another click. Together, these principles are derived from the doctrine that we know as political secularism. And it's important to stress, because of the time period we're in, that at the time the Constitution was written and this concept was developed, secular did not connote hostility to religion. It does not necessarily reflect that today, but the term is often used as if it did. Secular grew out of the distinction made actually within Christianity between those things which are sacred and those things which are profane. In a sense, secular realm is simply everything that isn't religion, and religion is the realm that is set apart from everything else. So it's not necessarily hostile to religion. The core notion of this doctrine, however, is that, and this was most best articulated by James Madison in his Memorial and Remonstrance, was that the state as a governing body, is simply incompetent in matters of religion. The state can't determine with any expertise which religious doctrines are true, false, beneficial, or harmful. And as such, the state simply has nothing to do with religion. In practice, this means the state should not allocate benefits based on religion. Religion shouldn't play into any decisions about who gets what, nor should there be any costs based on a person's religious affiliation. One should not lose any rights or any privileges because one belongs to a minority or disfavored faith. And the end result of this doctrine through these mechanisms in the Constitution, as understood by Jews, was that the US had a secular state, a state that simply didn't take positions about religion and in effect treated religion as part of that sphere outside of governance rather than relevant to governance itself. This was extremely important for American Jews. And if we can have the next slide, I'll try to show you why. Again, as it did for other Americans, the Constitution provided both civil and religious liberty. Now, we know, of course, it wasn't complete. Basic political rights were denied to men without property, to women, to African-American slaves, to many Asians and others. But the principle was there. And in providing both civil and religious liberty, they created conditions that Jews had never before experienced in their long history. The US was the first country which provided Jews with religious liberty in its fullest and most wholesome sense. And this experience led Jews to develop what I call a distinctive Jewish political culture. And that culture rests on the assumption that Jews have equal citizenship in a secular state. What I'm going to do in filling this argument out is to talk, first of all, about the origin and the content of this political culture. That is, what did it mean? I'm then going to talk about how this culture eventually became attached to a political party and how this culture persists today in the way in which Jews approach politics. I think you'll see the connection with both the activity of humanistic Judaism and in particular, the ideas of Jews for secular democracy. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay. So when political scientists use the term political culture, we talk about fundamental assumptions that people have about politics, ideas and norms that they carry around in their head. When we see something in the political realm we don't like and we say it's unfair or not right or un-American, we're really reflecting the values that our political culture tells us should be exercised in political life. And American Jews developed their own political culture throughout the course of the 19th century. Unlike other political ideologies, if you want to call it that, this political culture did not emerge like Marxism did from the pen of one intellectual scribbling lots of articles. It was a culture that emerged from the experience that Jews had in engaging in political life from the founding, from the late 1700s through their early experience. So it was a culture that emerged organically, if you want to put it that way. It was largely consolidated by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. It was still subject to challenge and debate, and I don't mean to suggest it was never altered, but the core of it really was in place by the beginning of the 20th century. And you see this culture emerging when you look at the discourse, the language that Jews used, both when they spoke to Jewish audiences, but equally when they spoke to non-Jewish audiences. This really became the language of politics that Jews adopted. Now, we know that political cultures don't just emerge, that they have to be transmitted to people, and they have to be transmitted anew with each new generation, or in the case of the United States, each new mass immigration of people who come from other cultures and other societies. And in the book, I talk about the means by which this political culture was transmitted to the Jewish masses. You find a lot of it in sermons and speeches given on holidays and anniversaries, both by rabbis and the Jewish lay leaders, and also on both secular and religious holidays. Thanksgiving and the 4th of July, not surprisingly, were the holidays where the sermons that were preached really talked more about the United States and what it meant for the Jews. You find that private correspondence among Jewish leaders, correspondence that was not intended for the public, was an also important mechanism by which this culture was developed. Many of those correspondents were, as they are today, lawyers and judges. So they had a particular perspective on this. Where Jews had private Jewish education, but also where they were clustered in large numbers in public schools, the culture that Jews developed was heavily influenced by the political culture that those institutions promoted. Most Americans would have accepted much of the Jewish political culture that was taught in the public schools. And then finally, when you look at Jews overtly engaged in public advocacy, you will see a fair amount of this culture. So let's talk about what this culture holds as its core beliefs. Next slide, please, Rick. I've boiled it down to 6 core items, and to say I could write a book about each one of them is true, so I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version. The first notion was that the Constitution was meant to govern only public life in the United States. Private life was to be left out of the Constitution. And that meant that religion, along with other institutions, belonged to civil society, not to the governmental sphere. In the words of one of the leading Reform rabbis of the day, the Constitution was written by men to govern men. It was not written to cover everything that's done in society, but only public functions. And it follows from that the United States, in the second tenet, was not in any meaningful sense a Christian nation. The United States had no religious identity. The absence of a religious identity in the Constitution generated an enormous amount of interest and controversy, both in the US and internationally. It was the first national constitution or founding document that did not claim a religious sanction for its state. If the United States has no formal religious identity, then the term Christian nation has no legal meaning. You could say a Christian nation is one in which a majority of citizens profess to follow the Christian tradition, but that has no legal standing. Christianity as such was not the religion of the state, although it may have been the religion of the population, or at least a majority. Jews, according to this culture, were in the United States alone equal citizens with rights guaranteed by law. They were not, most decidedly not, a tolerated minority. Jews at the time could not emphasize that Jews did not enjoy toleration enough. To the 21st century mind, it's sometimes jarring to see how negative Jews were in the early 1800s and throughout that century to the idea of toleration. The leading authority on religion and law in the Jewish community once characterized toleration as the sickly weed compared to the robust strength of equality. And their objection was the same one that George Washington had to the idea of religious freedom as a source of tolerance. Tolerance is a gift. It's given, and like all gifts, it can be taken away. So Jews stressed that they did not seek tolerance. What they sought was equality, the equality they were entitled to as citizens under the Constitution. That point was just central to this political culture. Jews also believed, as the fourth major component, that they had a special relationship with the United States. In part, this was because the US was the first country where Jews had been received with open arms, with equality, given citizenship and full rights, something they did not enjoy for a long time. France came later, although that was a temporary grant of civil rights under Napoleon's regime, but it took many countries, including England, nearly another century, to grant to Jews the same rights that the United States had provided to them. And that meant Jews had an obligation to be good citizens, to deserve the rights that they had received. It also meant that Jews had another obligation. They should keep Judaism out of their political language. It would be best, it was argued, if Jews did not form separate political organizations or separate sections within existing organizations. If something happened that Jews felt threatened their status in the United States, they should work with other Americans who were not Jewish, who were sympathetic, lest they be accused of seeking special rights that nobody else had. Jews always were to argue that the rights they enjoyed were the same rights everybody else enjoyed, no more and no less. Finally, the notion developed that Jews should be grateful to the American system. And the way you express that gratitude was first to teach these values to your children, very much as we're told in the Sabbath service on Saturday, to write them on the doorposts of thy house and upon thy gates. That it is our obligation as Jews to educate our children in these doctrines. It is also our obligation to monitor the public realm such that the culture, the political system that has been inherited is not transgressed upon. And when it is transgressed, Jews have an obligation to speak out against it and to insist on following what they understood was the point of the Constitution. Now, I've boiled this all down, but I can do it even further. When I was reading through the Jewish press, there were a number of national and major Jewish newspapers in the 19th century. I stumbled across an issue of the American Hebrew, as it was called, published on Thanksgiving Day on November 11th or November 26th, I think, of 1911. And I'm going to show you that phrase on the next slide, and I'll wait a moment and let you read it yourself before I comment on it. But this really is the most concise definition I've ever seen of the Jewish political culture that most American Jews had acquired by the beginning of the 20th century. Next slide, please. Okay, I assume everybody's had a chance to read it. This document just kind of hit me like a thunderbolt, this particular statement, which was written by an anonymous author. If you look at the first sentence about the rights of citizens being determined in light of citizenship, regardless of religion, what you really have is the core philosophical principle which Jews declared they stood for. The next sentence about the maintenance of this principle is a sacred obligation upon us says that this is our mission. This is really the mission statement. And the final sentence, which is very oddly worded, I certainly agree, can be translated fairly simply as, here's what we're going to do. Our major political priority is going to ensure that the secular character of this state is not disturbed. And this really is a kind of the mission statement of American Jews collectively from the late 19th to the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, now, I've kind of gone through very quickly what this political culture is and how it developed. And now I'm going to switch gears and move from the 18th and 19th century to the 21st century and try to show you how this culture still matters and how it helps to explain why most American Jews behave in a way that we would describe today as politically liberal. And then at the end of it, I'm going to try to bring these two themes together. So let's go to the next slide, Rick. Okay. I don't know how large this is showing up on your screen, but this reveals the most important thing about American Jews and their political behavior today. American Jews are overwhelmingly democratic. That is to say, they identify themselves as Democrats more than other groups, and they vote overwhelmingly Democratic. Indeed, based on identification alone, Jews are the most democratic group within the electorate among Anglos, white Anglos, to put it that way. What you see here is data running from 1994 to 2016, and it's the partisanship volunteered by Jews who were surveyed by the Pew Research Center. This data comes from a question that we've been asking in political science for 70 years now, something like, generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent? It is not your registration, the party you mentioned when you register to vote, because many states don't have that. This is simply a psychological sense of, are you associated cognitively in your mind with the Democratic Party? And what you can see is that over this period, the Jewish share of the population, the Democratic share among Jews, seldom goes below 70%. And the Republican share seldom reaches 30%. If this were extended forward to 2018 and 2020, you'd find even bigger differences. But you see there is typically a 50% gap, a massive gap, that makes Jews disproportionately democratic. And there's a lot of material on this. It's an interesting problem. So there are two things about this that are puzzling to commentators and political scientists. If we can have the click, please. The first puzzle about Jews being so heavily democratic and liberal in politics is that it contradicts what we know about the way people make political decisions. And it was expressed brilliantly by a journalist, Milton Himmelfarb, when he said in the 1960s that American Jews earn like Episcopalians, but vote like Puerto Ricans. As politically insensitive as that comment may well strike you, it really gets at this anomaly. Jews are, like Episcopalians, highly educated, have high levels of occupational status and high incomes. On average, of course, there are exceptions. And people who have those traits who aren't Jewish, like Episcopalians, generally support the Republican Party and hold conservative political views. Yet Jews vote like Puerto Ricans, who both at the time and today have much collectively, on average, lower levels of education, lower levels of income, and lower levels of occupational status. If you think this is politically incorrect, you're going to hate what Peter Sagal of Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me said some years ago. He was talking about the Republican frustration that Jews don't vote Republican. And Sagal said they wonder aloud, what is it about being rich and white that American Jews don't understand? And again, I understand it's politically incorrect to say, but it gets at this, the power of this anomaly. And political scientists have been trying to answer this question using more sedate language since the 1960s. But there's a second puzzle that's equally important here. Today, American Jews are the only diaspora community we know of, a majority of whose members are on the left side of their nation's political spectrum. When you look at other Jewish communities around the world for whom we have data, you will discover that there are lots of different patterns. Sometimes, as in France, Jews are centrist. Sometimes, as was the case in Canada for many years, Jewish voting was not different from the electorate in general. Sometimes in Australia and Great Britain, Jews are mostly on the right. But whatever the pattern is, we don't find any other country today where most Jews are so disproportionately on the side of what is the most liberal or left-wing political party. And any theory that explains this has to account both for why American Jews differ from non-Jews who resemble them socially, the first puzzle, and why they differ from Jews in other countries. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. Now, I want to talk about the way in which Jews became Democrats. It is important, in fact, it's vitally important to stress that the issues connected with Jewish political culture, the question about religion and state in the United States, did not become a partisan issue in the US until the 1970s. The two parties did not offer different positions on questions of religion and state until the 1970s. Indeed, in the 1950s, when it was proposed to add the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, Jews were not particularly exercised. They were a little less supportive than Protestants, a little less supportive than Catholics, but not really different, because those were not issues on which the parties took their positions. Before the 1930s, Jews had essentially been a population that varied in their partisanship from place to place and swung from period to period behind a party or against a party. There were serious, significant numbers of supporters of the Socialist Party, Communist Party for a time, but they were not characteristically democratic. Jews only became democratic in a movement that started in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And that, of course, was a response to the economic depression, and in particular, to the differing responses of the two parties. The Republicans kind of threw up their hands and said, this is the business cycle, we can't do anything. Franklin Roosevelt took office promising to address the Depression with government action, and the New Deal emerged from his first term. He recognized labor unions, to which many Jews belonged, and in general, Jews cast their light with the Democratic Party in the 1920s and 30s. So that Jewish republicanism collapsed at that period of time. And Jews remained massively, disproportionately democratic, pretty much without a lot of difference until the late 1960s, when Jews, like other elements of what was called the New Deal coalition, began to drift away from the Democratic Party. Now, even at the height of this drift, Jews still voted 2-to-1 Democratic in most national elections, but previously it had been as high as 3-to-1 Democratic. So there was some movement away. However, whereas other groups that had moved away from the Democrats, members of organized labor, Catholics, white evangelicals, all continued to evolve and move away from their core Democratic partisanship, Jews actually returned to the Democratic Party starting in the 1980s, more visible in the late 1980s. And the reason they did this, I argue, has everything to do with the political culture that I was talking about earlier. Jews, I would argue, have always been careful about trying to perceive threats to their well-being. It's a result, frankly, of our history, which, as you know, can be reduced in some minds to one continuous pogrom, where anti-Semitism is the key driver. And for American Jews, the ultimate concern has always been any threats to this liberal model of religion and state. Now, to the extent classic liberalism was under attack in the 70s, that attack actually originated on the left. Many Jews saw what was called hard affirmative action as a threat, because hard affirmative action involved having quotas, numerical quotas that would govern admission to higher education that explicitly factored in race. The hard affirmative action didn't last very long because there was so much political resistance to it. But to many Jews, this was a challenge to liberalism, which said the state should not factor into account individuals' traits in, again, distributing benefits or allocating costs. And to many Jews who were classically liberal, affirmative action was problematic, and there was movement away from the party driven heavily by this concern. But I would argue that starting in the 1990s, Jews saw a much bigger threat to the liberal regime of religion and state, and that was the emergence of the social movement called the Christian right, the movement that was manifest initially in a group like Moral Majority or Christian Roundtable. The Christian right, as we called it, took positions that seemed to directly threaten the regime that existed based on liberal principles. To begin with, it advocated allowing direct government funding of religious institutions, using federal taxes and state and local taxes to support religious institutions, which essentially meant Christian institutions. They also believed that public policy, the things we decide in the United States, should follow what they understood to be Christian values. And this was most evident on so-called social issues like abortion, homosexuality, and other such matters. And they called for an explicit, enshrining what they saw as Christian values in public policy. This movement alarmed Jews quite greatly. It's hard to remember back to that point, but almost every Jewish organization was issuing statements about the movement and sponsoring research on it to get a better sense of it. And I think the attitude of the community was nicely expressed by a prominent Reform rabbi who said, "When I hear Christian America, I see barbed wire," which is to suggest that the idea conjures up images of how Jews had been treated, not just in Nazi Germany, but as aliens in the countries where they might have lived for many generations. And Jews became especially alarmed when this movement became, as it is today, the base of the Republican Party. By that I mean this group is now the most strongly identified with the Republican Party and the group which votes typically 4-to-1 in favor of Republican candidates in presidential elections. You can't really become a Republican presidential nominee these days without the support of the Christian right. And if you do, you're going to have a hard time mobilizing Republican votes, as both John McCain, who was not really part of the movement, saw in his presidential run, and Mitt Romney saw in 2012 as well. But it means that the Republican base was now committed to lowering the wall of separation between religion and state. And this wasn't a threat to religious liberty as Jews understood it. It was a fundamental assault on a constitutional value that Jews held responsible for their success in the United States. Can we go to the next slide, please? You can go ahead and click. Okay. Many of the Jewish anxieties about the Christian right, which had been apparent in the 1990s, really took off in the year 2016. It's interesting when you think about it. In 2016, you might have expected Donald Trump to do well among the Jewish community, or do better than Jews had done before. After all, he had a daughter who was an observant Jew, son-in-law, and he was close to them. He had publicly made strong commitments to Israel. He had said he was going to withdraw from the Iran deal, which many Jews were dubious about. And of course, this was a person who lived in New York. He was in New York finance, New York industry, where he had a lot of Jewish acquaintances. His famous lawyer, Roy Cohn, was Jewish, and he had a lot of connections to the Jewish community. So one might have thought he actually posed a threat to the Jewish attachment to the Democratic Party. But there were other things that prevented that attachment from helping. To begin with, there was Donald Trump's close association with white nationalism. He welcomed the support of people like David Duke and Richard Spencer, and he made Steve Bannon, who had basically run the platform for white nationalism on the web, Breitbart.com. He was the patron of the alt-right movement, which is white nationalism. And it is important to understand that white nationalism is at its base, at its fundamental nature, hostility to Jews. White nationalists see Jews as responsible for the social, what they see as the social unrest and the success of African Americans in the American system. They hate Jews in some senses more than they hate African Americans. They don't love either kind. But if you look at the memes, if you look at the writings, if you look at the behavior of the groups, anti-Semitism is central to white nationalism. And Trump did not even disavow it. He claimed never to have heard of David Duke, the notorious Klansman and American Nazi. So that put him at odds with much of the Jewish electorate in 2016. Then we also had his attitude to the Christian right. The next click here. Trump decided to embrace Christian conservatives because they were the base of the Republican Party. And rather surprisingly, for people who said that Bill Clinton's personal history disqualified him as president, they, for the most part, embraced Donald Trump as well. And it was a very transactional relationship. He wanted their votes. He would give them what they wanted in terms of Supreme Court nominees and other policy decisions. Now, he certainly gave them the Supreme Court nominees they wanted. The other policy decisions, for the most part, are executive orders that have no force and haven't actually changed anything materially. But Trump became in a close alliance with Christian conservatives, despite the fact that this was a man who had cheated on 3 wives, abandoned 2 families, and clearly knew nothing about Christianity in any meaningful sense. So that alarmed many Jews in 2016. The next click, please. There was also Trump's repeated attacks on immigrants and other ethno-religious minorities. The famous claim that the judge hearing the Trump university case could not be fair because he was of Mexican origin, as well as the attacks in general on immigrants from African countries and other places, his attacks on ethno-religious minorities, on the handicapped or whatever. Jews, I think, have a long history and a very sensitive antenna when political leaders start attacking groups that are minorities, because our experience has taught us you may start attacking, Mexican immigrants or other groups, but usually those result in attacks on Jews as well. So those factors really alarmed Jews in 2016. And interestingly, this alarm was, I think, best expressed not by somebody on the left, not by, say, a Rachel Maddow or somebody with those political views, but by somebody with impeccable right-wing credentials in the Republican Party. Let's have another click here. James Kirchick is a very thoughtful leader in modern conservatism. And in March of 2016, when Trump became effectively the party's nominee, Kirchick opined that during these last few months, I've come to appreciate the Jewish identification with liberalism, both in its classical and modern American form, more than at any other point in my life, and in a way no history book or sermon by a rabbi could relate. The fate of Jewish life in the West is inextricably bound to democracy, pluralism, religious tolerance, and ethnic harmony. This is a strong conservative voice saying that Trump threatens all the values that Jews regard as central to their own security and success in the United States. Let's go see what difference it made in the election. Next slide. In 2016, Trump lost the Jewish vote by an effectively 3-to-1 margin. If you throw out the votes of the third-party candidates, it was closer to 4-to-1. In terms of financial contributions, based on research done by a couple of political scientists, Jews in previous elections, or donors who could be identified as Jews in previous analyses, typically gave about a third of their money to Republican presidential candidates. In 2016, Trump got only 5% of money given from identifiable Jewish donors. I mean, Mitt Romney got a third, Trump got 5%, which shows you how much he alienated Jewish voters. And Jewish mega donors in 2016, even conservative and Republican, turned out to be much less pro-Trump in their contributions than their non-Jewish peers. You can see just how badly Trump did among Jews if you look again, not so much at liberal or moderate Jews, but conservative and or Republican Jews. The Republican Party has an organization like the Democrats have called the Republican Jewish Coalition. And its main job is to raise money from Jewish donors for the presidential campaign. In 2016, it was reliably reported less than 1 out of every 5 board members of this group, a board composed of people, wealthy Jews who've been major political contributors, less than 1 out of 5 actually contributed to Trump's campaign. Moreover, if you look at the views of major conservative and Republican commentators across the board, they were anti-Trump. Whether you're talking about Charles Krauthammer, Bret Stephens and David Brooks of the New York Times, Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, William Kristol, of course, one of the most influential Jewish Republican leaders. Whoever you looked at, and virtually all Jewish former office holders who were conservatives and Republicans rejected Trump. One could actually say that the Never Trump movement is a Jewish movement. I would not say that more broadly because it would simply provide ammunition to those on the right who are already anti-Semitic. But there's no doubt that even among Jews who should have been attracted to Trump, there was enormous resistance to him in 2016. 2018, Jews voted again more than 4-to-1 Democratic compared to Republicans in their vote for House elections, House districts. And while we don't have any more recent data that I trust, there is a survey, or there's a combination of surveys from Gallup. Gallup is unreliable on this matter for technical reasons that I won't go into. But there was a survey of 1,000 Jews in February of this year. And that survey showed that when you presented Jews, self-identified Jews, in a survey, with a question, are you going to vote this year for a Democratic or Republican presidential candidate? You see Jews were their traditional 2-to-1, favoring any Democratic nominee over Trump. And when you look at how, when Trump was allied against the whole range of Democratic candidates, it didn't matter very much who the candidate was. You can say that the favorite candidate of the Jews to get the nomination was actually Pete Buttigieg, who is in sort of sense every Jewish mother's ideal son, even though he's not Jewish. You've got, he had topped the list at 69% of the vote. And you'll notice that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were at the back of the heap in terms of their support among Jews. But it doesn't really matter. These differences are trivial and they're very likely due to sampling error. But it's clear that Jews were disproportionately inclined and are inclined to vote against Donald Trump. Jews actually vote more Democratic than they identify with. This is the other thing. So when it says, 2-to-1, it's probably in practice closer to 3-to-1. And I would not be surprised this year when the election returns are finally together and we have all the survey data, all the opinion data, to see a 4-to-1 margin among Jews voting for Vice President Biden as opposed to Mr. Trump. So the point I want to make here is that American Jews today follow a tradition in which concern for a secular state, a state which does not factor religion into its decisions, is not a new development. Jews for a Secular Democracy may be a new organization, but the value they stress is a value that has been very common in Jewish political culture since the beginning of the 20th century. And I think the inability of Republicans to attract Jewish voters, which we're likely to see this year, and we've already seen it in some of the primaries, is likely to be permanently or significantly affected for a long time, given what happened. And not just what happened before 2016, but given to some of Trump's comments after Charlottesville and other statements he's made, despite the overtures he's made to the Jewish right. So if we can go to the next slide.
Why did Jews vote for Trump? That's the question.
I mean, why even?
I will thank you for listening and welcome any questions or clarifications you might have. Thank you very much.
And I'll take down the presentation for now. Great. Thank you so much, Ken. Let's all thank him for a superb analysis that is very, very insightful.
Thank you, Ken. I noticed.
Thanks, Ken. Thank you.
Very good.
Tremendously interesting.
So we're going to go on to questions and answers and discussion. If you can, I'd like you to. I'm going to take Ken off of spotlight so that I can see all of you. Please raise your hand or physically or electronically, and then I'll call on you. Richard?
Yeah, I'm a lifelong liberal Democrat, and I certainly voted for and supported Obama in 2008 and 2012. And I voted definitely for Hillary in 2016. But I wondered how common this is. I was a little bit shaky on some of the support for Israel coming from the Obama administration, from some, like people like Susan Rice. Can you speak on that? How common was that some liberal Jews were a little bit shaky on Obama's support for Israel and the Democratic Party's support for Israel?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Richard. From a macro view, I think it is important to stress that American Jews do not factor Israel heavily into their voting decisions. People might wish that was the case, but in point of fact, it is not the case. And increasingly, American Jews will say that Israel is not important to their decision. So even if there is some degree of anxiety, it typically doesn't translate into moving very many votes. Now, that being said, I think there's no question that on the one hand, Obama had a problem with Benjamin Netanyahu, that personally the two didn't like each other and didn't get along. But of course, that's not unusual with Netanyahu. I think to get along with Netanyahu, you also have to be divorced 3 times or 2 times. So that's why Trump and Giuliani seem to get along with him. But in terms of the underlying strategic relationship, I think it's important to listen to Jewish security experts who said during that time that we'd never had as close security cooperation with Israel as we did in the Obama years. Now, simultaneously, there was tension over the political solution and the US commitment to a 2-state solution versus Netanyahu's desire to have a single state and to either expel or to somehow silence the voice of the Palestinians. So there's tension there. And you see the tension in some of the factors, some of the groups that are part of the Democratic coalition today. It became obvious that Ilhan Omer, who grew up in a Somali community, kind of inherited that perspective, and Rashida Tlaib, same kind of thing. So there is some of that sentiment in some of the far left. And there's no doubt that the Democratic Party continues to try to be an even-handed partner in the sense that they want to have a voice that will enable them to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. Trump, on the other hand, as we know, has gone in full force supporting the Israeli position on everything except the permanent settlements, which actually Trump shot down. The idea that Israel could annex all of the West Bank and all that. That was dead with Trump. And it was clear that the attempt to get the relationships with the UAE and Israel was sort of the price Netanyahu was willing to give up the annexation idea for that. So there is some tension, but I think today there's going to be more tension about the inroads made by the Christian right, by the white nationalists, the alt-right, groups like QAnon, which is kind of a movement as well, within the Republican Party. As you know, there's a Republican congressional nominee who will probably win a seat in Georgia, who is a firm believer in QAnon. And again, the core of their philosophy, if you look at it, is it's this cabal of Rothschilds, which is the term they use for Jews, that is threatening democracy. The estimate I've seen is that the number of Republican candidates for Congress who are sympathetic to QAnon is between 40 and 70. And that's a huge share of the party.
Crazy.
So I think that, and when we get close to the election, the Jewish community is going to get a lot more information about this. Right now, it's kind of been fringe, but it's going to be more concentrated. So I think that if there's anxiety about Israel, in general, it's going to be shown on the left. Now, there are 2 exceptions to this rule. And again, I'm sorry for going on, but it's another question I know somebody was going to ask me. In general, my argument about why Jews vote the way they do has to recognize there are 2 communities within Judaism who don't follow the liberal tradition. One is those Soviet Jews who arrived here after 1989, the refugees, not simply the refuseniks, but the broader group who were able to come here after the Soviet Union ended in 89. And these people were essentially pre-socialized to Republican loyalty because they felt that Ronald Reagan was in some way responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the research that we've got now shows that that's a one-generation phenomenon, and that people who came here as children or were born here to the Russian post-1989 immigrants are now indistinguishable from other American Jews, which is to say they're Democrats. So that's a short-term effect. The other community for whom Israel is critical is modern Orthodox Jews, who identify strongly with the state of Israel and who are the religious equivalents of the settler movement in Israel, although there's more variety among American modern Orthodox Jews than among their Israeli equivalents. But many of them do see the political world through Israel, and they largely believe that the Republicans are more supportive than the Democrats. I don't quite know how they've developed this view, but that's the view that has been out there. The ultra-Orthodox Jews, what we mistakenly call the Hasidic Jews, tend to be much more transactional in their vote. That is to say, they look for things that will provide resources for their own community, and they will in effect vote for the candidate who they believe is going to give them most of what they want. And it's often very local. The same rabbis in the same part of New York will support different candidates, but they're also much more morally conservative. So they're more sympathetic to some of the social goals of the Christian right. They just want in on the resources that come around.
Right, they're not for LGBTQ rights as much as the mainstream Judaism numbers are.
The largest groups within ultra-Orthodoxy are anti-Zionist. It's worth it not forgetting non-Zionist. Some non-Zionist, some anti-Zionist. So Israel, they've said things like, I'd rather be ruled by an apostate Muslim than a Reformed Jew, to use an expression that one hears in Israel. So they're driven by a different set of factors. But the statement I made covers the vast majority of American Jews who are neither Orthodox nor 1989 refugees or adult refugees from Russia.
Okay. Jor, go
Try
ahead.
to give shorter answers to other questions.
No problem. Jor?
Hi. Thanks, Ken. Quick question. Why do Jews feel so strongly about secular government in the United States, but on religious government in Israel?
Hey, Jor, good to see you. The evidence we have suggests that American Jews are in fact bothered when they become aware of what I'll call the theocratic elements within Israeli political culture. And many of them indeed have problems with that kind of movement. As you know, much of the human rights movement within Israel was funded by American Jewish groups who trained many of the civil rights lawyers who now argue cases in Israel on behalf of women, on behalf of Arabs and other organizations. So I think that they would prefer something closer to American liberalism, and they've kind of applauded the efforts of, for example, Aharon Barak and others. He was a student of getting his name, the lawyer at Harvard, Alan Dershowitz, who have had law cases that have successfully challenged some of these more theocratic elements in Israeli law. I think other Jews just kind of say, well, I have issues with that, but that's to me not the core issue. They're more concerned about Jewish continuity, and they see Israel as important enough that they can work on those issues without becoming anti-Zionist. But we know that among young American Jews, there's been a clear distancing from Israel. And while there's a lot of debate about the source of that distancing, I think increasingly it's a sense that Israel is not the kind of country in terms of its social policies that they would feel comfortable with. And so there's been this gap that's been growing among younger American Jews.
Do you think that it's a little self-serving in the sense that you're for secular government in the United States because you're a very small minority, but you're comfortable with the religious government in Israel because they're your majority?
Yeah, there is tension between those views. And I think that, people decide how much significance to give that issue in affecting their overall attitude to Israel. I mean, I know personally, I'm a strong believer that the Madisonian model works well here. It doesn't necessarily work every place. But I would like to see Israel get rid of some of those elements and become more sensitive to women and so forth and so on. So, I contribute money not just to JCNCF, which goes to very targeted social programs, but to others that support the civil rights movement in Israel. And I think you're going to see that pattern. In fact, it's more common than people think now, and I think it's going to become yet more common.
We have a question from Elliot, who's asking, do you fear anti-Semitism by Black Lives Matter organizations?
I think there is mostly what I would call some anti-Semitic sentiment within the Black community. Some of it comes from those traditions that are religiously fundamentalist, and there are many Black fundamentalists who repeat the traditional Christian attacks on Jews. And I think it's there. And there is some hostility that grows out of what I would call the normal patterns of ethnic succession in American cities, when a lot of the landlords and business owners in predominantly Black areas were Jews. And there's, and as Jews have gradually been succeeded by, Koreans and others, that tension has developed there as well. So it's there among some. But I find it to be a sentiment rather than something that for the most part drives behavior. I worry a lot more about the men with guns on the right. Frankly, the alt-right scares the hell out of me. And, we saw in Kenosha the shooting of 2 people by an alt-right supporter, a 17-year-old kid. And if you look at the attacks on Jews, physical attacks that have taken place over the last 3 years, as far as I know, only one of them involved an African-American, and there appears to have been mental illness in that case. So yes, there's anti-Semitic sentiment, but it's where it turns into behavior that I'm much more worried about.
Mhm. Thank you. Sharon?
Yeah, I've always heard that there's a big difference in terms of political attitudes between Sephardic and...
Could you speak louder?
Yeah, I've always heard that there's a big difference in terms of political affiliations between Ashkenazi and Sephardic American Jews, and I wonder if that's true with Ashkenazi being more likely to be liberal and Sephardic less so. I don't know if that's true or not.
I'll be honest and tell you there's very little data available about that because Sephardi Jews are such a small share of the American Jewish population. And most of the, I was director of the Center for Jewish Studies at UF, so I did a lot of fundraising in South Florida and talked to a lot of potential Sephardi donors. And it was interesting that in all the conversations, their priority is to maintain the Sephardi style of worship in Judaism. That's what they talk about more than anything else. And, they wanted to know what we could do to help them. And we had to explain as a public university, that's kind of not what we could really do. So I don't know, I would imagine that as Sephardi in Israel tend to be more hostile to Arabs in general, it would not surprise me that Sephardi Jews in America, depending again on whether they came from, say, Morocco or Yemen, I think there'd be differences, would be more traditionalist in their views. I guess I'd put it that way. But it's not. There are a lot of Sephardi organizations that develop and then are gone in a year or two. I think it's such a small share of the population. And again, most of the Ashkenazi Jews who came to the United States, many of them came out of the socialist movements in Russia and Romania and so forth. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're right. I just don't have data to confirm that.
Thank you.
I have a question about the view of the importance of a secular state by non-religious, by nuns, people who are atheists, agnostic, and how important it is to them compared to Jews, given that we've seen that the US is lagging Europe in terms of the percentage of the population that's non-religious.
Well, actually, we're no longer lagging. Nuns have now become the fastest growing religious minority. And I want to stress we're talking about N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. And again, we ask people a general question to indicate what is their religious, people often use the term religious preference, which is not a term I like, but do they identify with any religious tradition? And the proportion of people who say none, they have no particular religious attachment, has been shooting up in the United States among the millennials and the people behind them, Gen Xers. It's much higher. In fact, there are almost as many nuns as now are Catholics. So the proportion here is catching up quite dramatically. And the nuns it turns out the nuns are a very diverse group. There's a great new book that'll be coming out in a few months from Cambridge, and I know this because it's in a book series I edit, and I've been involved in reviewing the book and the like. And it's about sort of the politics of religious nuns. And it turns out both their religious and their political views are quite interesting. They're not necessarily atheist or agnostic. They're just indifferent to religious labels to a large degree. But in general, they focused a lot of their attention on the concern with secularity. And they have gradually, as the two parties have come to define themselves, with the Republicans defined in lowering the wall of separation between religion and state, the Democrats defined as keeping Jefferson's high wall, you've started to see the nuns swing decisively toward the Democrats in elections, clearly because of this issue. But it remains the case that Jews are today still more democratic than religious nuns. So, but yes, it's remarkable. If you want data, I have actually one of the slides that I didn't show, but you have to scroll through it for a while, so I won't bother to show you. But if you're curious, look at that slide that talks about the voting patterns or the partisanship of different groups, because you see the nuns in there. So we are becoming, in that sense, more like the Europeans, in that we're sort of divided into a small share of the population that's extremely religious, an equal share that's secular, and then a larger group in the middle. You're muted, Rick.
Doug, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just was saying you were muted, so.
Ken, this is a great presentation, fascinating. I have a question that, I don't know, maybe you'd have to devote an entire session just to talking about this, but the United States is obviously kind of an outlier in terms of Jews and their success and thriving in this particular country. And I'm assuming a lot of that is a result of the Constitution and the things you talked about near the beginning of your presentation. But we're also an outlier in comparison to other industrialized democracies in terms of the influence of the Christian religion and how much prominence and how much influence they have. And I've heard that, you know, the Constitution as an explanation for why Jews have become who we are in this country is also kind of a factor in how Christians became who they are. Do you agree with that thesis? And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. Well, there's no question in my mind that Jews historically did, and I think continue to see the Constitution as what is partly successful for, responsible for the success of Jews in the United States. And that for all the problems and, you know, to the extent Jews still face anti-Semitism, the sense is that Jews, like other minority religions, have a better situation in the US than they do in most other countries. And this doesn't make one indifferent to the flaws of the Constitution, the way in which it collaborated with slavery and denied rights to women and other, you know, systemic racist components of it. But yes, I show the view for American Jews, it's been good. It's also been good, ironically, for evangelical Christians. And it really is important to distinguish when you're talking about Christians, first of all, between Protestants and Catholics, but among Protestants to distinguish between three different populations: Black Protestants, what we call, or used to call, mainline Protestants, and evangelical Protestants. And Black Protestants are their own tradition. They tend to be theologically conservative but politically liberal, simply because of their experience of being denied freedom. Mainline Protestants, by which I'm referring to denominations like the United Methodists, the United Presbyterians, the Congregational churches of the US, and so forth, used to be the core of the Republican Party. And they are not social conservatives. They were economic conservatives. They believed in limited taxation and lower business regulation. But they did not, you know, social issues like abortion and the like were not a real concern to them. And mainline Protestants today are much more liberal, for example, on abortion or sexuality than are true. They're almost identical to Jews, not quite, but they're there. Evangelical Protestants, on the other hand, are very distinctive theologically and politically conservative. And they used to be heavily democratic. The Solid South, as we used to call it, was an evangelical vote. And that, of course, started to change. The real irony is that the decision to keep religion out of the Constitution, to separate religion and state, was largely driven by evangelical Protestants of their day. They opposed the idea of an establishment of religion in the US because they felt it would establish the wrong religion. By the wrong religion, they were talking about what we call Episcopalianism and what, of course, are called Anglicanism, in the rest of the world. And they felt that better not to have the state do anything with religion than to give state power to the wrong religion. And it's worth noting that Episcopalianism and the other favored religions during the colonial era discriminated against the evangelical Protestants. Now, back then, the evangelical Protestants were Methodists and others. So ironically, Jefferson and Madison's closest allies in trying to create a secular state, although they didn't use that language, came from the evangelical community. Baptists have a very long tradition of supporting strong separation of religion and state. That tradition survives in an organization called the Baptist Joint Committee, which is sort of an ACLU for religiously liberal Baptists, what we sometimes call the American Baptist Association, or incorrectly Northern Baptists, which is very different than Southern Baptists, who came along later. And so in a sense, it is the evangelicals who brought around the separation of religion and state, which evangelicals today are trying to conjoin. So it's one of life's ironies. They don't fully appreciate the kind of, the way in which their own strength grows out of that historical tradition. So.
Good. Jonathan?
Thank you, Ken. I was thoroughly convinced when I read your book, and hearing it live too, I remain convinced. I have what may sound like an odd question. In your approach, you basically, I'm going to put it this way, Jews glom onto liberalism. For separation of church and state helps to protect them as a minority group, is kind of, what I take as the core of what you're saying. And that drove them in a certain political direction. Do you think liberalism influenced Jewish religious belief as well? Kind of how Jews practiced Judaism, what they believed in about the world, how they organized themselves. Here, for example, here's a group of Jews, humanistic Jews and Jews for a secular democracy. Our religious practice is almost built around this kind of stuff. Our belief system, if you will, is almost built around this stuff. So do you think it influenced, not just it was instrumentally kind of a useful belief to protect Jewish ethnic interests, if you will, but that it became a part of liberal Jewish ideology or belief about the world for non-political reasons?
Okay. I'm going to give you your fellow academics, so you will, of course, expect on the one hand, on the other hand kind of answer. That's what I'm going to give you. On the one hand, I tend to be skeptical of claims that religious doctrine causes the adoption of certain political views or outlooks. The claim that sort of liberalism is intrinsic to Judaism, whereas other, conservatism is intrinsic to Roman Catholicism and the like. I'm skeptical of those arguments because I think religious traditions are so rich and so diverse that you can probably combine them in at least a seemingly sensible way with every political tradition there is. So in general, I'm not a strong supporter of that school of interpretation. On the other hand, when I look particularly at the evolution of the Reform tradition in Judaism, begins, of course, in Germany and then follows the German migration after 1848 to the United States. It doesn't start then, but it really picks up steam. And there's no question in my mind that classical liberalism was a doctrine that many of the German Jews brought with them, those who were in the Reform tradition. And it's worth remembering Reform was by far and away the largest tradition within American Judaism very early in our history. And so I think that some of the ideas here that religion is, you know, outside of the state, religion should be free, religion is different from nationalism, and the whole idea that I mean, Reform Jews had, that we don't need a Jewish state because we have everything we'd want in the United States. You know, I think that some of those ideas did translate into a philosophical basis. You know, they were there. And again, people invent traditions based on, you know, these fragments of different thought systems. So, you know, and there's no question that today, many American liberal Jews believe that liberalism is simply applied Judaism. There is that belief. And of course, they ignore the fact that there are, you know, politically conservative Jews who believe that conservatism is applied Judaism. And there are these mostly intellectual debates. They typically don't get to the congregational level. But so while I have some skepticism, I do think there were aspects in the doctrine of classic liberalism that made sense to Jews. And the idea that the state should not favor religions. I mean, you know, that's so central. And therefore to think of religion as a voluntary choice is something that I think did become a philosophical position apart from self-interest. So some of this and some of that.
I have another question. Right now we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment for giving women the vote. But, you know, during that time period, it was the heyday of eugenics and a beginning of a reaction to the massive immigration of Jews and other ethnic groups from Eastern and Southern Europe, and leading to the basically total cutoff of immigration of Jews in 1924. How did that affect the Jews' perception of a government that was secular?
Well, let me think for a second. So for the Jewish community, and then I'll tie it more to their perceptions. For the organized Jewish community in the US, the mass immigration of Eastern European Jews to the US was a challenge because the Eastern European Jews were very different culturally from the Jews of Western Europe, from the German Jews, the Austrian Jews, French, and so forth in their historical patterns. The German Jews were, for the most part, Reform in their orientations, whereas the Jews from the Eastern Europe who were religious were what we would today call more Orthodox. Many of them were, of course, socialists, so that was a different phenomenon. And wherever in the world you had this massive influx of Eastern European Jews into Western societies, whether you're talking about Britain, France, or the US, the organized Jewish community was concerned that their presence would stimulate anti-Semitism and would consequently promote the kind of legislation that ultimately was passed here in 1924, which limited immigration. And so there's no question that the Jewish community here, which was mostly German, mostly Ashkenazi, but again, Western European in its orientation, tried very hard to promote acculturation among the Eastern Europeans. And it's interesting to observe that they simultaneously pushed for easier immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe while recognizing the challenge it presented. And this came up in all sorts of ways. There were movements for immigration restriction very early, long before it finally passed in the 1920s. And at one point, for example, there was a provision that said that if you cannot read and write a language, any language, you're not to be allowed to immigrate to the United States. Well, the organized Jewish community, these Sephardic Germans, elites, said, wait a minute, that's not fair to German women in particular, to Eastern European women in particular, who really weren't allowed to go to school. and they didn't read or write any language. They could speak Yiddish, but they didn't have schooling or the religious background to make sense of it. And so they pushed successfully to include Yiddish in the list of languages in which you could be held capable. So it would get you in the United States. So there was an awareness among the predecessors that the Eastern European Jews presented potential problems to the status of Jews in the US, and ultimately they wanted to preserve the pipeline. I don't know that there's much, I don't really know how the Eastern European Jews themselves reacted to the cutoff of immigration. It was kind of striking. There were the famous hearings about the immigration naturalization law that became in 1924. And there were big congressional hearings. And I've read those congressional hearings and they're fascinating. And they're fascinating because the Jewish advocates kept saying to the senators and congressmen, look, you can't consider these people Jews. At that point, if you immigrated to the US, you were called of the Hebrew race. Both my parents, who came over in '39, on their docking, on the docking statement that the shipping agencies had, race, they were listed as Hebrew as late as 1939. And they said, look, they're not Jews, they're not Hebrew, they're Russians or Romanians or whatever. And they really struggled hard to say this is not a Jewish issue. You know, this is an issue about we should recognize nationality because that's what we're dealing with here. And yet, in the hearing room itself, Congress made the decision that all the Jewish organizations should testify on the same day, and they were all at the same table. And that sent the message, this is a Jewish issue, in a way, despite their constant efforts to say, this is not about being Jewish, this is about fundamental human rights. So I don't doubt that the Eastern Europeans got a sense that, well, maybe we're not as welcome here as we thought. But I think it was also, this is still better than Russia or Romania. And I don't think you see much evidence of that they saw this as sort of, you know, a Christian problem per se. Again, the American Jewish community worked very hard to transmit to the immigrants their understanding of the United States as a secular state. There are textbooks that were published in Yiddish by the American Jewish community for the newcomers. And there were massive adult education classes. And I've even got the transcripts or the syllabi of some of those classes. And they keep saying, what makes America unique? Separation of religion and state. So I think that those efforts probably overwhelmed the efforts to sort of make them see, uh-oh, you know, this is a religious problem.
Okay. But any final comments or questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Ken. As many of the participants have already indicated in the chat, this has been just fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It was my pleasure.